Okay, so you sent us a ton of stuff on Hurricane Milton. Articles, forecasts, even a whole podcast outline. Seems like you're pretty concerned about this one, and I gotta say, looking at all this, I can see why.
Yeah, and you're not alone. This whole thing has everyone on edge, especially here in Tampa Bay.
Yeah, this whole explosive intensification thing is pretty wild. I mean, going from a tropical storm to a Category 5 monster like that, that's scary fast.
It really is, and very few hurricanes in the Atlantic have ever intensified that rapidly.
And you think about Hurricane Wilma back in '05, right?
Exactly. Devastated parts of Florida. And that rapid intensification is what makes Milton so dangerous. It just doesn't give people a lot of time to prepare, especially with the way it's projected to move.
Right towards Tampa Bay. That's got to be a nightmare scenario, right?
Yeah, it's the worst case scenario. And the biggest fear with a storm like this heading straight for the mouth of Tampa Bay is the storm surge. Imagine like a skidding top, right? Pushing water right towards you. That's the kind of force we're talking about with Milton's counterclockwise winds. So if it makes landfall near Pinellas or Pasco County, like they're saying, it's going to push a massive amount of water into the bay.
So it's like Tampa Bay is a giant bathtub and those hurricane winds are the faucet.
Exactly. And that faucet is about to be turned on full blast. So we're not just talking about coastal areas like Clearwater and St. Pete flooding. This water could surge inland. I mean, you could be looking at South Tampa, MacDill Air Force Base, even downtown Tampa being impacted.
Wow, so the whole bay basically becomes a danger zone. Has Tampa Bay ever seen anything like this before?
Well, you have to go back a ways. 1921, a Category 3 hurricane hit the region directly, caused an 11-foot storm surge. And that was just a Category 3, so...
Imagine what a Category 5 can do.
Exactly, and that's why everyone's so on edge. This is a stark reminder that even though it's been over a century, Tampa Bay is still incredibly vulnerable.
It's kind of a scary thought. And what's even scarier, even if Milton weakens a little before landfall, like some models are suggesting, that storm surge...
Still a huge threat.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Think of it like, even if you turn down the faucet a little bit, if the tub's already full, it's still going to overflow, right? That's the thing with storm surge. The water's already been pushed towards the coast. That momentum doesn't just disappear.
So we've got this ticking time bomb of a hurricane with its rapid intensification, its beeline for Tampa Bay, and the potential for a massive storm surge, even if it weakens slightly. What's the latest on the ground? Are people already evacuating?
They are, and this is where things get even more tense, right? Because you're talking about a densely populated peninsula with very limited evacuation routes. You know how bad traffic gets on a normal day? Now add in hundreds of thousands of people all trying to leave at the same time. It's a recipe for gridlock, which is why officials aren't wasting any time with evacuations.
Yeah, from these reports, it looks like they're considering evacuations for Pasco, Pinellas, Hillsborough, Manatee, Sarasota counties. That's a huge chunk of the population.
It is. And some experts are even saying that people further inland, like in Polk County, even those areas toward Orlando, need to think about evacuating too, especially if they're not in a very sturdy structure.
Wow. So it sounds like they're really taking a prepare for the worst approach here, even if the forecasts show Milton weakening a bit before it hits.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, Hurricane Katrina really showed us that even the most well-organized evacuation plans can be overwhelmed by a major hurricane. And the Tampa Bay area, with its geography, those challenges are even greater.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of people that need to move, and quickly.
Yeah.
It creates a whole other set of dangers.
Yeah, it's like a traffic jam with a hurricane chasing you. Pretty scary stuff. So knowing that, are there any lessons learned from past hurricanes, like Katrina, for example, that really apply here?
Oh, absolutely. One of the big ones. Don't wait to evacuate. If you're in an area under an evacuation order, you really shouldn't wait until the last minute. You're just putting yourself at a huge disadvantage and, frankly, putting yourself and others in danger.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially with so many people potentially trying to get out. So it sounds like preparing for that worst case scenario, even with these forecasts suggesting some weakening, that's got to be the best strategy.
Exactly. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
And that preparation goes beyond, just knowing your evacuation route and packing some supplies.
Okay, so what else should people be thinking about?
Well, the source material mentions this thing called the pinhole eye phenomenon. It seems Milton is currently exhibiting this.
The pinhole eye. Okay, I've got to ask, what is that?
So most hurricanes have this, a pretty well-defined eye in the center of the storm, right?
Yeah.
Like the calm at the center of this swirling vortex.
Right.
But with Milton, the eye is unusually small. It's contracted. Imagine the difference between looking through a normal peephole and one that's been shrunk down to the size of a pinhole.
Okay.
That's kind of what we're seeing here.
And what does that mean, practically speaking?
Well, it can mean a couple things. While not always the case, this pinhole eye can often mean a very intense, tightly wound hurricane.
Uh-huh.
And these types of storms are often prone to, you know, rapid changes in intensity, weakening, then re-intensifying really quickly.
So it's not a guarantee of anything, but definitely something to watch closely. Is there anything else in your research that kind of gives us clues as to how Milton might behave?
Yes, actually. Some sources mention that Milton is currently undergoing something called an eye wall replacement cycle.
Eye wall replacement cycle. That sounds intense. What is that?
So you know how the eye wall is that ring of the most intense thunderstorms around the eye?
Yeah, like the walls of the hurricane's inner core.
Exactly. Well, sometimes a hurricane's eye wall can actually weaken and collapse. Then a new eye wall forms further out from the center. So it's like basically the hurricane is rebuilding its most powerful part.
Wow. Okay, and how does that impact its strength? Does it get weaker or stronger during this process?
It can do both, actually. So initially, as this eye wall replacement cycle happens, the hurricane might weaken a bit.
Okay.
But that weakening is often temporary. As that new eye wall forms and contracts, the hurricane can actually re-intensify, sometimes even stronger than it was before.
Oh, wow. So even if Milton weakens a bit as it goes through this eye wall replacement cycle, it could actually become stronger before it even hits.
It's possible. And there's another thing. As the eye wall expands during this process, it often increases the hurricane's overall size. The wind field gets bigger. That means a much larger area could be impacted by those hurricane force winds.
So even if you're a little bit outside that initial projected path, you could still be in harm's way.
Exactly. And this is what makes it so hard to predict these storms, right?
Okay.
You can't just focus on wind speed. It's the intensity, the size, the track, and these rapid changes. All of that makes hurricanes so dangerous.
It's a lot to take in. And we've talked about, the immediate dangers, the wind, the storm surge, but what about the long-term impact of a hurricane like Milton? What can people expect there?
Yeah, the long-term impacts are often overlooked, but they can be really devastating.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just on the economic side, you're talking about, well, the cost of repairs and rebuilding. That's just the start, right? You've got to think about things like tourism taking a hit, supply chains getting disrupted, businesses struggling to reopen. It can take years for local economies to bounce back.
Yeah.
I mean, look at Hurricane Andrew back in '92. Some of those communities, it took them decades to fully recover.
It's like this ripple effect. One thing leads to another, and suddenly you're looking at long-term economic hardship.
Right.
And then there's the environmental impact too, right? I mean, the coast is such a delicate ecosystem. Absolutely. You could be talking about serious damage to coastal ecosystems, wetlands, wildlife habitats. I mean, think about it. A storm surge like this doesn't just bring water.
It brings salt water.
Exactly. And that can be devastating to those environments. It can take years to recover from something like that. Some may never be the same. We tend to focus on the impact on people, but the natural world, it really takes a hit too.
Yeah, it's pretty overwhelming to think about. Is there any good news here?
Well, there's always hope, right? And I think one thing that always shines through in these situations is the resilience of the community. Time and time again, you see people coming together to support each other, neighbors helping neighbors, volunteers coming from all over. It's a reminder that even when faced with these incredible challenges, the human spirit can overcome.
It makes you realize, no matter how tough things get, we're not alone in this.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to be prepared, and to listen to what local officials are saying.
Right.
By doing everything we can to minimize those risks and to prepare ourselves, we're not just helping ourselves, we're helping our entire community.
So as we're looking at all of this hurricane bearing down on Tampa Bay, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
Knowledge is power. By understanding these storms, by understanding the unique risks that Tampa Bay faces, and by being prepared, you're giving yourself the best chance to get through this safely.
Right.
Pay attention to those evacuation orders, have a plan, and remember, you're not in this alone.
That's right. And even if it gets tough, even if this hurricane throws everything it's got at us, there's always hope. Stay informed, stay safe, and know that we'll get through this. We always do.